Welcome back to Revealing the Truth. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and our topic today is racism in the church. We spent a good hour and a half with Pastor Fred Jemison, a member of the board of directors here at Igniting a Nation Ministries, and the senior pastor of Pilgrim Home Baptist Church. And I'm very glad, I'm actually very excited to introduce our next guest who will be with us during this segment. To introduce you to Ahmad Ward, who is currently the Vice President of Education and Exhibits or Exhibitions at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And he's been there almost 18 years. And I looked at your career and was impressed that your longevity, your commitment to this. You hold a master's degree in museum studies, and you're involved in the community, serving as a board member of Caring Men and Caring Women Incorporated, a nonprofit agency which believes that mentoring is a key to unlock the true potential of young people today. Ahmad cares about arts and culture, children, civil rights and social action, economic empowerment, education, the environment, human rights, politics, poverty alleviation, and he believes that his life should make a difference in this community. So Ahmad, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you, Rabbi Walker. I appreciate being here.
You know, when you and I talked, and I mentioned the topic, and I kind of shared the story with you that I was watching the presidential debate, and I heard three words: the black church.
Right.
And it pierced me in such a way that I had never heard of such a thing. Here I was, a white Jewish kid from Pittsburgh. Racism was not an issue. When I came to the South, I experienced it and became much more aware of it.
Right.
But I first became aware of it because of discrimination against Jews and blacks. So I felt it from the Jewish side. Then I began to realize, and although I was quite familiar with Martin Luther King, the I Had a Dream speech, I was college educated, knew history, my own history as being the first of the post-Holocaust generation had a whole different identity. I was identifying with my Jewish history, with my Jewish heritage of enslavement, my Jewish heritage of persecution. Now I'm here confronted with another culture's strife and struggle, and understanding now that we share a ministry of suffering.
Absolutely.
Together. 5,000 years of our history merged with hundreds and maybe thousands of years of your history. So I talked to Pastor Fred Jemison about the experiences and the birth of the black church, birthed out of slavery, that its origins were that as missionaries went to Africa to preach the gospel, and then the harvesting of the blacks for American slavery, that the gospel was being preached aboard ship, that these communities were growing up within the plantation environment, and that evolved into a different ethnically cohesive church.
In terms of the American black church, I think so that's correct. Because if you go further back, you can see Christianity in Ethiopia way before slave trade.
Well, you see Jewish Ethiopians.
Right.
Actually, this was my reference,
Mm-hmm.
was that everybody talks about the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem on the last Passover, and how the people greeted him with waved palm fronds. Save us, O King, son of David. And as you looked out at that crowd, it wasn't all who you think was there.
Right.
The blackest of the black, the Ethiopians,
Mm-hmm.
were there because there were Ethiopian Jews.
Exactly. Exactly.
There were Chinese Jews. There were Korean, what would be we call Korean today. So you had Asian Jews, you had African Jews, and you had European Jews. There was only 3 continents ever mentioned in the Bible.
Right.
So you had Asian Jews, African Jews, and European Jews of every different color, every different flavor of Jew. So then, as the gospel now goes out through Paul, through the gospel being preached after Jesus, reaches into the continent of Africa,
Right.
through Egypt, okay, through Morocco. Okay. The first 200 years, it was a very Jewish thing. So the Moroccan Jews of Northern Africa
Mm-hmm.
came to faith in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It was more Jewish believers than there were non-Jewish believers for the first 200 years before Rome really got
Right.
their hands in the mix.
Yes.
So take me back. Take me back to the genesis, if you will, of what we call the black church today.
Well, I think you've already kind of touched on the beginnings when you get to the Americas. And when you talk about slavery, we have to talk about the notion that the Americas, well, North America or the colony, that was where the smallest amount of Africans went. You know, the majority are in South America. They're in the islands, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, below is South and Central America. So you had, I don't know, maybe 150,000 that actually come up into the Americas. And they introduced to Christianity, as you mentioned. What happens is you have black preachers come up on these plantations because there are some churches where slaves were allowed to come in.
Right.
But for a lot of cases, they weren't. And so, because they were preaching good news, these black preachers were allowed to hold court somewhere on the property, or even in some cases, actually build a structure for their churches.
Okay.
So the black church becomes solidified there. You also see in the black church where you have revolution begins. There's a story of Nat Turner, who was a preacher. And folks who have limited knowledge of Nat Turner's rebellion don't understand that he was an actual preacher.
Okay.
So you have this.
Well, maybe our audience isn't familiar with
Nat Turner led a infamous slave revolt around 1831, where they decided that we were going to be free. They were going to be free, and they took a violent tone to it. Like, you know, he was able to see some of the things that were happening to his people, even though he technically was insulated from the violence in a way, but just decided that he was going to fight for freedom in any way possible, and that meant that they actually raided plantations and killed people because of what had been done to their folks.
Okay.
So that revolt when that revolt was squashed, they took great lengths to make Nat Turner an example, because the whole point is we can't have you thinking that you can have full freedom. To think that you can actually get out of this situation. So one of the real crazy hypocrisies about slavery and Christianity is used to justify slavery, right? You've heard about the curse of Ham and things of that nature, or it was adapted into Southern Christianity as it's okay for us to do this because these people aren't really people.
Right.
Because we view them as children of God, and maybe we can't justify these horrible things that we're doing to separating families, castrating people, breeding humans for labor, ripping mothers from children as soon after childbirth so you can sell them across state lines. You know, you can't righteously support that if you believe that these people are the same children of God or child of God that you are. So that's why you have aspects of the book being used to push that idea that slavery is something that is almost ordained by God in some cases, whereas what we know that freedom is for everybody, right?
Of course.
And the book talks about all men being children of God and all men have a right to the tree of life, right? But that is something that is not completely given to the people that are involved on the plantations as slaves. So when you move further along into Civil War and there's emancipation, the black church becomes this entity from that point on where everything takes place. That is the seat of power for the black community. That's where your future politicians are grown. You get further along in the 20th century, that's where the businesses are born out of. The pastors are the most respected people in the communities. So when you get even further on to Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, that's where your leadership comes from, because the black church is where all of that actual organizational power for black people is created. Organizational power for black people comes out of the church. Okay. And so the church has always been the backbone for how things have been pushed during the Civil War, in emancipation, all the way through Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, Civil Rights Movement, and beyond. It's only probably recently that you've seen that level of power kind of dissipate a little bit. So the black church, quote unquote, has been a power broker. It's been a protector. It has been a shield. It has also been the driving force to push change. So I can understand if you've never heard of the term the black church, it would kind of like, well, what does that mean? Are we all one church? Well, the black church was specifically there for black people because they couldn't do other things. Right. That black church sent kids to school. That black church fed people when they were hungry. That black church was able to bail people out of jail, whether they were supposed to be there or not supposed to be there. So the black church has been a backbone for this community for hundreds of years. And when people refer to it as the black church, I think it's seen in that way as having that power in American structure or American fabric. So even now, when you see things happening in communities, you see pastors black pastors trying to step up in these communities, trying to take care of business, because that's where the seat has been. Right. Even though the push for the last 40 years is to get more black people in political power, right, political structures, right, to be able to actually change legislation at the legislative level instead of trying to rely on people to have a change of heart or convince folks to do the right thing when maybe it's not in their best interest to even listen to you. And so the black church as a whole has been that one constant, especially in the 20th century, that one constant that was there for black people when nobody else was.
Is the black church recognized by the non-black community in the same way that different denominations recognize? It's not really a denomination.
No, it's not a denomination.
It's a demographic.
It's a demographic, yeah.
So that's kind of different.
Yes and no. I think if you're looking at how people recognize it, they probably recognize it as a political power in some cases.
So the identification with Jesse Jackson, with an Al Sharpton, with a Louis Farrakhan, would that be who? Well,
I don't want to.
Who's the Martin Luther King of today?
I don't think there is one.
Who is the voice of the black church today?
The voice of the black church? I think you have several voices in the black church, but you don't have a designated leader of black churches or the black community as a whole. And I don't think you need one defined leader, and I'll explain why. Okay. I think Dr. King and others like him made great strides, were able to get us in a lot of situations where we wouldn't have been able to get to unless they pushed. But one of the things that goes along with that one leader, one voice, is the problematic view that black people are one thing, one thought, one mind. We all think the same. You know, it has never been that situation. You know, black people have always had diversity of thought, diversity of viewpoint.
Of course.
But when you look at how rights and privileges have stacked up, generally as Americans, black community is viewed as having one train of thought. So that's why you have people say, well, if this black person thinks that this is okay, then why do you think it's not? Well, we don't all think alike.
Right.
and that has been one of the problems with that. Well, you need to disavow this person because they said something because you're black, or you can't talk about black on black. You can't talk about things happening with police brutality until you deal with Chicago on black crime, as if the entire black community can uproot everything that they're dealing with and just focus on a city that is in dire straits, obviously. But you know, those are micro invalidations. You heard of microaggression. Those are micro invalidations. So you can't have a point until you take care of this, which really it lessens what the community really is. And so I think what we try to push, well, I try to push personally, what I try to do is the development of leaders. You know, if you are responsible for your community. Your community might right now be your household. That ripple effect is supposed to take place. So if you take more time being responsible for your community, you can push this thing out and develop leaders so that you don't have to look to one person. Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton do not speak for me.
Same conversation that Fred and I just had. To a certain part of the world, the Pope speaks for all Christians.
Yeah,
there's a perception.
Perception of that, exactly.
Okay? Because of the media has positioned Jesse Jackson, Louis Farrakhan, and Al Sharpton as the spokespeople.
Mm-hmm.
So, not being a part of that community, I fall prey to the same level of misunderstanding as others do when thinking the Pope's speaking for me as a believer, that it's all lumped together.
Right.
And because most people don't care enough.
That's the ticket. Yeah.
Okay? Most people don't care enough to ask the question or pick up the phone, call you like I did, and say, what is this thing that I just heard of? I've never heard of this before. Why would this Jewish kid from Pittsburgh ever hear about it to begin with? But now that I've heard it in a presidential debate,
right.
And I hear it, is this out of division? Is this out of racism? Is this out of choice? Is it a separation that drives a wedge in the body that is disunifying? And if it's disunifying, then we as a body are divided. Then a house divided against itself cannot stand. Is this the reason why Christianity has lost so much of our influence in the laws of this nation?
It's a necessity, has been a necessity. The black church has been a necessity because there was no one else to advocate for black people except for the black church.
See, it's interesting because most people don't know about the black robe regimen that I refer to as really being the threat to Britain.
Mm-hmm.
That it was they called them the black robe almost as an insult, but they were the pastors. And it was the pastorate that brought the message forward about freedom, about taxation. Many of the sermons were summarized in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, that those were the key influencers. So as you look at the spheres of influence, the centers of influence, especially of community influence, it is the pastor who is to be the most influential. He's the one to drive change or protection or build the fence, build the wall, provide the programs, advocate and be out there with the city leaders, representing the needs of the flock, the sheep, the neighborhood. Now what's happened is from the birth of the black church to today, we now have social service agencies within government that have taken on that role. And from an advocacy standpoint, the black church still seems to be necessary, but doesn't have the voice that it needs.
I don't know if it does. And part of the problem is because so many things have happened. Like we're in an age where we don't view things the same way. I think you have people that are stepping away from religion.
Yes.
For various reasons.
Right.
Some of that is because Christians drive people away from time to time.
Well, I've said it before that Christianity is the worst thing that ever happened to Christ.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense because, well, it makes sense because people, there's something that I learned from Wiseman. There's religion and there's relationship. And so relationship puts you in a different format, right?
Right.
You know, so you have direct connection. With religion, if you're watching religion, then you also are watching pastors and men and women who are supposed to be leading congregations or leading the flock commit adultery.
Yes.
Molest children.
Yes.
Cheat on taxes, do things that are... And so folks who are looking see that and well, you're just like me. You're just like the rest of the world. So why should I do this? And that's a much deeper situation in black church versus, you know, the
absolutely.
So I think some of that is the voice is dampened because folks are looking at men, but not acknowledging that men are fallible.
True. They become man followers as
Right.
opposed to God
They become
followers.
man followers, and that's always going to get you in trouble. I think that you do have some people who are trying to do the right thing by their communities in their congregations, but you also have something that we have to look at. There's a great dichotomy here with Christianity and black people because of what we just talked about before. Your belief is in God, Christ, whatever. But you have seen people do things to you
Yes.
who claim to be Christians. So you're a believer, but you know that those people that were burning crosses in front yards, that were attacking people for trying to register to vote, that murdered folks in the mid-20th century, were also the same folks going to church on Sunday morning, leading the Sunday school,
Right.
preaching in the choir, singing in the choir, preaching in the pulpit, being deacons, and didn't see that was a problem. Now, how can you, on one hand, do this kind of evil to somebody, but then go to church and be the most holy person there? And so that also works in the background of all of this. And so I think when you have color division, there's something to that which goes back to your original premise about black church versus white church, because you have black Christians who probably don't trust white Christians.
Right.
With documented reason. So, and that goes back to the biggest one of the biggest problems about our American structure is that we do not tackle the specter of race in honest ways.
Well, and this is the point of this, why I'm doing this today.
Right.
It was almost a matter of, if not me, then who? Here I'm part of a race of people that's the most hated and reviled race in the history of mankind. There's only 14 million of us. We're the only population in the world that's decreased since 1938. In 1938, we were 18 million.
Right.
Today, we're 14 million. We lost 6 million in the Holocaust. Anti-Jewish sentiment is growing in the world because of Islam, okay, who is purposed to annihilate the Jew by design.
I would push back on that a little bit. More than a little bit, actually. I
Right.
would push back on that. Islam the religion, I don't believe is designated or designed to look for the murder of the Jewish people. You have radical forces, just like you have radical forces in Christianity, who have done things in the name of Christ that have been evil. I think it's the same thing. And it goes back to people are people are people, and people generally will do evil things, even using the name of religion to do that.
And I agree in part, except that 1 out of every 50 verses in the Quran is dealing with violence. So the doctrine of the document, I stand on this document, the Bible. A lot of violence in there.
Oh yeah.
There's annihilation. There's annihilation to come.
Right.
Okay, of descendants of Esau. God says they'll be wiped out. We know who they are, where they are. We know that a war will come, and it will bring the elimination of the Edomites, the ancient line of Esau. And that in order for all the things to happen to bring Christ back, all are violent.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of them are violent acts. But an understanding of what we as a community, the Jewish community, how we responded was as we tucked in closer.
Mm-hmm.
We built our own community centers, we built our own hospitals, we built our own home for the aged, we built our own humanitarian aid organizations, we built our own Jewish Defense League. We created the Simon Wiesenthal Center for to fight against anti-Semitism.
Right.
And so we put the full wealth of knowledge and skill of oppressed people who were relegated to only certain jobs, and we became the best at them. And now, percentage-wise of population, more Nobel Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, patent holders, based on percentage of population, the Jews hold a higher, because we had to far exceed. It was a defense mechanism for the community. So I understand the community pulling together and being birthed out of necessity, because that's what we had to do ourselves.
Okay.
Today, racism is almost at the highest level that I've known, and I'm 65 years old. I lived through the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I see it getting worse instead of better. What's changing?
I believe in being as honest as possible about talking about this particular topic, so I will do it here too. I think you've had a level of racism that has been steady.
Oh, agreed.
Steady.
It never went away.
For
never went away.
years.
Yes.
Right? We are in an information age where things that normally wouldn't be reported or talked about are now being talked about. And incidences that people have discussed forever now have video attached to them, or you have first-hand accounts, and everything is automatic now, because something can happen in Turkey 5 minutes from now,
right,
and we'll know about it immediately,
Correct.
right? Because we're all connected. And so I think it's the same thing with racism. I think your average enlightened black person would tell you that they've never seen a dip in racism. This has been constant. Now it's just out front. Some of that is, like I just said, there's information age,
Right.
things are out there. Some of that is pushback because the election of the first black president in history did not really create a post-racial situation. It created the pulling off of the scab. So things that certain people thought would never take place starts to take place, and then it is panic. It's panic time. So that the subtleties of racism no longer are important. So it's now I am out front with it. I'm saying what I would make justifications about why this isn't racism.
Right.
And we've allowed people to whitewash racism to the point where unless you are calling me the N-word, racism does not exist, which is categorically false.
Right.
And it denies systematic and institutionalized racism and structure that has been in place since we were emancipated.
So, help me with this, because here's my struggle.
Okay.
If 76% of American adults say that they are Christians, and there are 250 million approximately adult Americans, right, then statistically there's 200 million adult American Christians. Are only the 50 million that are not Christians racist?
No.
And the Christians, saved by grace, created in the image of God, saved by the shed blood of Jesus, the same plan of salvation that you have accepted, I have accepted, but yet there's just as many Christians racist
Yeah.
as there are non-believing.
Absolutely. So is the problem is not the conversion, it is the person. Right? It's not in the power, it's not the power of God, it is the people. And some things are culturally passed down. Like,
Of course.
you're supposed to be a new creature, correct? However, if your grandfather, your father, your brothers, your uncles ascribed a certain way, and they were able to justify it in their brains for 3 generations,
Right.
that this is okay, you're going to view it as okay.
Well, that's the statement I made earlier, the quote that Jesus may be in your heart, but Grandpa's in your bones.
That's a good quote. And it is true. I think, racism is a learned thing. Like, you don't come out of, you're going to come out of the womb with some things, right? But not hate.
No hate. That's exactly what I talked about. I've been to the room with all the babies, the nursery.
Yeah, no
and there's
hate.
never been a white baby to turn its back on a black baby and say, "Oh, there's a black baby over there."
It's trained. It is trained.
It's a learned
And
behavior.
We pick some of it up. It's not all, and here's where I think people get affected by this. It's not all. I'm hearing Grandpa say, blankety blank these folks, blah blah.
Right.
It is a culture of how we interact. You get some of this stuff by osmosis. You get trained to see how people interact with other folks, how they indirectly talk about people, and you internalize it. And we are all. This is one of my quotes. We are all victims of race.
Yes.
Every person who walks, specifically this country, everyone who lives in this country are victims of race. You suffer under it in some form or fashion. Either there's direct action or the idea of supremacy that you have either consciously or unconsciously adapted.
See, God's word says that everything that's hidden in darkness must be brought out into the light.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is the level of racism has not changed. The level of information has exposed and brought into the light.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's one of my points, yeah.
What has been hushed, quieted, but still there. So, as Christians, how is that loving your neighbor as yourself?
It's not.
It is not. So therefore it's anti-black, anti-Jewish, actually anti-anything.
You could possibly, use it.
Is anti the Word of God. I'm pro-Jesus.
Mhm.
I'm not anti-Arab. I'm not anti-Muslim. I'm not anti-homosexual. I'm pro-Jesus. I am for the Messiah. I am for the Lord. I am not against. And therefore, to be a believer, did Jesus' blood was only poured out for white people?
No.
Therefore, the equality comes. You and I share nothing in common. Nothing. I went to Penn State. I was bar mitzvahed. I was trained to read Hebrew. We don't have a lot in common.
Maybe not.
But yet, we both believe in the same Messiah, which means we have everything in common that matters.
And that's how it's supposed to be. That is on his face. That's how it should be.
Absolutely. It's absolutely how it should be. But it has to happen just like salvation, one person at a time.
Oh yeah, you have to change hearts of minds. You have to change hearts.
We have to be willing to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be willing to say, on this program, revealing the truth, that we're actually going to reveal the truth. The calling for this program was that we were going to talk about the things that people have been thinking but won't talk about, because they're concerned about offending, they're concerned about losing support, they're concerned about the congregation, the building, and we're a self-sustaining through contribution ministry. We don't sell our time.
Right.
We don't have sponsors and advertisers. We're like an NPR kind of model.
Gotcha.
And the Word of God says, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole concept of revealing the truth, and here we are in our first week on the air, and I'm going to talk about racism.
This is very ambitious.
Yeah,
Right.
Right off the bat, let's just go ahead and hit it. Let's
Yeah.
take everything that is taboo to talk about and spend 4 hours talking nothing but that, and looking at it from his history, and looking at it from society, and looking at it from philosophy and understanding. And the truth was just revealed to me, that the level of racism is only perceived to be increased.
Right.
It is only a perception, and it's a false perception, because it's always been there at this level. It just hasn't been exposed at this level.
At this level, yeah.
So the information availability, and the Fergusons and the Baltimores and the Columbus, Ohios, and the situations, they've been going on
Right.
all along.
Oh, we've always had we've always had a quote unquote somewhat adversarial relationship with police, because the word officer derives from overseer. The police force is a direct descendant from the overseer force on the plantation. That is fact. So it's already there. And when you're in a position where you want to have faith in the police officers, I have friends that are police officers. I want everybody to be safe. And so when we do conversations about interactions, that's how we go into it. For our young black youth, hey, you want to get home? They want to get home. But there's also the reality that here I am. I'm 41-year-old. I'm never been in any trouble. I do everything I'm supposed to, pay taxes, all that good stuff. But I have had situations with police that I didn't feel safe. Most of my peer group has had that. I got stopped a week before Christmas, and it was a regular stop until I saw both doors open. Then I get nervous. And at 11, my father is teaching me how to stand and to interact with police officers. You probably didn't have that experience at 11. But by the time I'm 11, he's telling me, you look him in the eye, keep your hands out. Make sure they see your palms. You say yes sir, no sir. You make no moves. You don't do anything. You don't talk funny. You don't talk crazy. You don't make jokes. You speak to them face to face. Yes sir, no sir. Ask permission to make any motions and keep your hands where they can see them. And if the cops came in here right now, rushed in situation, I'm going to fall into that training 30 years later.
See, it's so interesting because I was raised completely different. I was raised when I was asked the question, what was I? I was trained as a child to answer that I'm an American. Not to say that I was a Jew. Because being
preservation.
Because of,
right.
And so
it's preservation.
It was survival. This is your answer. And this is what you say. When they say to you, what are you? And this one says, I'm Catholic. Oh, this one says, I'm Baptist. This one says, you say, I'm an American. And that's all you answer. You add nothing to it.
Yeah.
Because never again will we suffer because we're Jews.
And it's a defense tool. It's a defense tool.
It is a defense.
So, but, these couple weeks ago, when I leave the situation, they let me go. I don't know if they were looking for somebody or what, but you have a nice day, sir. But I still had to pull over,
right,
and get myself back together, and mad at myself a little bit for getting jumpy, like to the point where the officer knew that I was jumping, and tried to bring it down. And that's not a feeling that you should relish having, but that's the experience. And so when you mentioned these incidents, Ferguson, Baltimore, you had Newark and Watts and Bensonhurst. I mean, there has been a long line of it.
Right.
It's just now somebody's got a cell phone.
What's interesting is you sharing that about your father teaching you at age 11. These are the stories that need to be told.
Yeah.
I think there's a tremendous lack of understanding.
Absolutely.
I think there's your role in education this is your vocation, your calling is to educate, to be available to answer questions from people like myself that was not a part of the civil rights movement, was affected by it, as we all were. It changed the Bill of Rights. It changed hiring practices. It changed discrimination laws. It changed everything. But when you hear someone's testimony, the story of their life, and you can identify with that, I can go back to my childhood and say, here's how and we exchange that story. All of a sudden, that wall of division starts coming down.
Oh, it has to.
And we begin to focus on, wait a second, before we had nothing in common. Now we got a childhood experience in common. Maybe we're a whole lot more like each other.
Absolutely.
Maybe we grew up a little bit more like each other than we
think,
actually presume.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe more of these dialogues need to start happening.
Oh, yeah.
And this contact, and it's what I tell people with contact with the Lord. When you get close to God, God is the roughest sandpaper hitting the highest places on you. All right? And it hits you and you pull back as fast as you can because it hurts. But if you'll stay there long enough to let God get those high places, pretty soon doesn't hurt anymore.
Right.
You're still making contact, and when you look, that's not sandpaper, it's a polishing cloth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a rough piece of wood, it's a shiny piece of ebony to a high gloss finish.
Yeah.
God uses things in the natural to reveal supernatural truth. The black community doesn't want me to do more for them. They actually want me to do more with them.
Right.
God does not want you or I to do more for him. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills.
Right.
What does he need for me to do for him?
Right.
He wants me to do more with him.
Exactly.
And so unless the communities start to come together, unless we actually become intentional about revealing the truth, being willing to put it out there on record, going out over every internet connection in the world, will be on our YouTube channel several hours after we go off the air for a replay. But right here on Revealing the Truth, very honest and candid, racism hasn't changed. Information about it.
Yeah. It's access. But also, it is not access for every community. It is access for certain communities who have not been privy to things that have happened to disenfranchised communities. I won't just say black people. They'll
Right.
open that up to all kind of disenfranchised communities, because I think what you have is a situation where folks made assumptions that all of that harsh stuff ended in '68,
Mm-hmm.
when it didn't, and so it is a culture shock. The same culture shock you felt when you heard the black church being used in presidential debate is the same culture shock when people actually hear someone say, "Hey, it's never changed for me," because
Right.
it upsets the apple cart.
It does.
And we've made ourselves comfortable by thinking, "Oh, well, that's other people do that. We don't. That doesn't happen anymore." Until you show them examples. Yeah, it does actually happen. It has happened. It continues to happen.
Right.
And then people are faced with realities, and it's cognitive dissonance for some people, where it's like, even though you have facts
Right.
smacking you in the forehead, I still have to stay here in this belief, because this belief helps me to sleep at night. This reality is problematic. Let me lean here and continue to think that this is over with, because otherwise I have to question things that I do not want to face.
I tell you, I'm so thankful for you to be here with us
Absolutely.
here on Revealing the Truth. This conversation today, for many, may have been uncomfortable. Talking about racism in the church, that people who have professed a faith in Jesus as their Messiah participate, whether or not it's visibly, actively, or just within their hearts, a racial prejudice. That these situations that are being exposed under the banner of Black Lives Matter or Hands Up, Don't Shoot is not something that's a new creation, but something that's been going on for what we were led to believe had gone away, has never really gone away. And that we become complacent the same way we can become complacent with sin, the sin of homosexuality, the sin of gluttony, the sin of adultery, the sin of pornography, the sin of stealing, lying, all of that. Racism falls squarely in the middle. And if we truly are that new creation, that born again, born of the Spirit Christian, then it is anti-Jesus to be anti-race. For he came because God so loved the world. That is an all-inclusive, all the world. Jew and Gentile, those are the only two people in the Bible. That's all there is. That's it. That is the sum total of the Bible. There are only two people groups in the Bible. There are Jews and Gentiles. That's it.
Very correct.
And through the shed blood of Jesus, now there is one new man. There is not black or white. There is not male or female. There is not Greek or Jew. But for those that profess faith in the promised Jewish Messiah Jesus, we are united as a family. One body, one God, one Savior, one family. and that it is an unchristian, unbiblical, ungodly position to be a racist.
Yeah.
So, can you truly be a Bible-believing Christian and be a racist?
I think in your brain, you probably think that you are, but you are not hitting the notes that you need to hit if you can still see racism as something that you ascribe to.
And this is what we do. We convince ourselves of our own truth, and we replace our truth for God's truth. Ahmad Ward, I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you
on Revealing the Truth. Go visit the Civil Rights Institute. Have him at your organization, your next engagement to hear the truth in a city where so much happened, so much rich history. Maybe if we started to talk more about these kind of issues, maybe, just maybe, healing would begin and unity could be found. Thank you for watching Igniting a Nation, Revealing the Truth. We'll be back with you tomorrow at 9 o'clock a.m. right here from the Igniting a Nation Broadcast Center. Don't forget to visit our website, ianbn.com. And later on today, you can go to YouTube, send your friends to YouTube, to the Igniting a Nation channel for the replay of today's broadcast. Until we see you tomorrow, we say shalom.